He's been called the most dangerous arms dealer alive, a man who armed rogue nations, fueled wars, and made millions, all while hiding in plain sight. The FBI wants him. Interpol hunts him. But no one can touch him. This is the story of Carl Lee, and how one man rewrote the rules of the global arms trade. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Zimo Voice. Your support keeps us bringing you stories the world tries to hide. In the hidden corridors of international crime, few names inspire as much fear, mystery, and speculation as one man, a shadowy figure who has been called the world's most dangerous arms dealer. He is not a warlord in the jungle. He is not a general commanding soldiers. Instead, he is a businessman, a merchant of death whose weapons never carry his fingerprints, but whose deals can alter the balance of power between nations. His real name is Li Fengwei, but the world knows him by another, Carl Lee. For decades, intelligence agencies across the globe have chased him. The FBI, the CIA, Israel's Mossad, Britain's MI6, Germany's BND, all have tried and failed to bring him down. On the FBI's most wanted list, his name stands alongside terrorists, drug lords, and murderers. But unlike most, his bounty is extraordinary: $5 million. A price usually reserved for heads of terror networks or fugitives responsible for mass bloodshed. So who is Carl Lee? How did a man born in one of the poorest corners of China rise to become a figure so dangerous that even U.S. presidents personally demanded his capture? And more importantly, how has he managed to escape justice for so long? This is the story of an invisible man. A story of weapons, espionage, betrayal, and geopolitics. A story of how one arms dealer changed the course of nations while the world watched helplessly. Carl Lee was not born into power. He did not come from money, nor from a family with influence. He was born in Heilongjiang province, in the far northeast of China, a place known for its bitterly cold winters, endless fields of corn and soybeans, and the smokestacks of decaying factories. This region, once celebrated as China's industrial heartland, had fallen into decline after the Maoist era. By the 1970s and 1980s, unemployment and poverty shaped the lives of millions. For a young man growing up here, the future seemed uncertain, almost hopeless. But Carl Lee had something most others didn't. He had a sharp mind, a deep fascination with technology, and instinct for opportunity. While others saw despair, he saw possibilities. China in the late 1970s was undergoing massive change. Mao Zedong was dead. The Cultural Revolution had left the country scarred, intellectually starved, and desperate for rebuilding. Then came Deng Xiaoping, the reformist leader who opened China's doors to the world. He encouraged science, industry, and global trade. And in these shifting winds of history, Carl Lee found his opening. He studied metallurgy and engineering, disciplines that seemed boring to many, but that gave him the keys to understanding a world very few ordinary people could access. Metallurgy is a science of metals, alloys, and materials, the foundation for making weapons, machines, and even nuclear technology. At first, he lived a life of a quiet researcher. He was just another face in the crowd at state-owned factories and laboratories. But inside, he was learning the secrets that would one day make him indispensable to dictators, warlords, and even governments desperate for power. What made Carl Lee so unique was not just his technical knowledge, but his ability to combine that knowledge with ruthless business instincts. He realized something most scientists never do. Weapons are not just tools of war. They are products. They can be packaged, marketed, sold, and delivered like any other commodity, if you know how to hide the paper trail. By the 1990s, as China's economy was rapidly transforming, Lee had begun building connections. He set up front companies, legitimate-looking businesses that on paper dealt with steel, machinery, or construction equipment. Behind the scenes, however, they were involved in something far more sinister: the trade in banned materials, restricted technologies, and weapons components. The world did not yet know his name, but soon intelligence agencies would begin to notice. It started small. Unusual shipments, disguised as harmless industrial goods, were intercepted at ports. They were traced back to obscure companies in China, names no one had heard before. But the deeper the investigation went, the more often one name appeared in the shadows: Carl Lee. By the early 2000s, American analysts, Israeli operatives, and European security officials all realized they were not dealing with a small-time smuggler. They were dealing with a man who had the knowledge, the resources, and the networks to alter the military balance of entire regions. And it wasn't long before his weapons began showing up on some of the most dangerous battlefields in the world. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Carl Lee had perfected his system. He used layers of front companies spread across Hong Kong, Macau, and the Chinese mainland. On paper, they sold everything from industrial tools to agricultural equipment. But in reality, they were cover operations for one of the most sophisticated smuggling networks in the modern world. It was around this time that his path crossed with one of the most isolated and desperate regimes in the Middle East, Iran. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran had been locked in conflict with the West. Following the bloody war with Iraq in the 1980s and decades of sanctions, Iran's military found itself strangled. It wanted advanced weapons. It wanted technology that could match its enemies. And above all, it wanted missile systems capable of reaching across the region, and maybe even beyond. The problem? Almost no legitimate country or company would dare sell them these materials. That's where Carl Lee stepped in. He offered what the Iranian military needed most: access to restricted technologies, guidance systems, specialty metals for missile casings, and components for long-range rockets. To Iran, he was not just a businessman, he was a lifeline. In return, Lee received not only millions of dollars in payment, but also something far more valuable: protection. Operating under the umbrella of Iran's Revolutionary Guard meant that even Western intelligence agencies struggled to touch him. He was shielded by a government willing to do whatever it took to keep his pipeline alive. But Carl Lee didn't stop with Iran. Once he realized the model worked, he expanded. He built a web of customers that stretched from North Korea to Syria, from rogue African warlords to South American cartels. Anyone who needed weapons, especially those cut off by sanctions, found their way to Carl Lee. He was clever, too. Instead of moving weapons directly, he often shipped the raw components. A crate labeled machinery parts could contain high-grade alloys for missile construction. A box of electrical equipment could hide gyroscopes used in nuclear programs. This way, even if a shipment was intercepted, it was nearly impossible to prove its true purpose. By the early 2000s, U.S. intelligence officials began to take his operations very seriously. They discovered that many of the missiles Iran tested bore traces of Chinese materials and components. Each test was a reminder that somewhere, far away, a man was making millions by fueling instability. And yet, Carl Lee himself remained an enigma. He rarely traveled outside of China. He avoided photographs. He never boasted publicly about his wealth or power. He lived in the shadows, but the ripples of his actions could be felt across the globe. What made him so dangerous was not just his ability to sell weapons. It was his ability to stay invisible while doing it. By now, agencies like the CIA, MI6, and Mossad had all placed him on their radar, but they couldn't agree on how to stop him. Some feared that any direct action might anger Beijing, since Lee's operations were deeply entangled with state-owned factories. Others believed that Carl Lee had become too important to eliminate, that he was part of a much larger machine, one where governments secretly tolerated black market dealers when it suited their interests. Meanwhile, Carl Lee's empire continued to grow. Each successful deal emboldened him. Each shipment made him richer. And with every transaction, he inched closer to being crowned the world's most dangerous arms dealer. For Israel, Carl Lee's growing empire was not just an international crime story. It was a direct threat to national security. Iran's missile development program was aimed squarely at Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem. Each time Iran tested a new medium-range rocket, Israeli analysts traced the supply chain back to one place, China, and often to one man, Carl Lee. The Mossad, Israel's legendary intelligence service, launched several covert operations aimed at mapping out Lee's operations. They followed shipping routes, intercepted communications, and even tried to flip some of his middlemen. But Lee had designed his empire to be slippery, decentralized, and deniable. A shipment seized in Dubai might trace back to a Hong Kong company that no longer existed. A bank transfer in Macau might link to a shell corporation that dissolved the very next week. Each time Mossad thought they were close, Lee was already 2 steps ahead. Western intelligence agencies faced the same frustration. The CIA and MI6 put together profiles, dossiers, and classified reports that painted Lee as a centerpiece of a sprawling black market network. The U.S. Treasury Department began to quietly blacklist his companies. But even that wasn't enough. Every time one company was sanctioned, another appeared, sometimes under the name of a cousin, sometimes under a completely different industry disguise. To investigators, it was like battling smoke. What made Carl Lee even more untouchable was a suspicion that he enjoyed at least some protection from the Chinese state. China, after all, had a long history of using unofficial networks to extend influence abroad. And whether or not Beijing directly supported Lee, one fact was clear. He was operating inside China's borders, and no foreign intelligence service dared to launch a direct raid or arrest attempt there. For Mossad, the stakes grew higher with each Iranian missile test. In 2008, after a series of long-range rocket trials by Tehran, Israeli defense officials were convinced that Carl Lee's materials had made the launches possible. The Israeli press began to hint at the existence of a ghost supplier somewhere in Asia, though his name remained hidden from the public. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats debated what to do. Some argued that Lee should be publicly exposed, shamed on the world stage as a global arms trafficker. Others warned that such a move could trigger a diplomatic crisis with China. So, instead, they watched. They gathered evidence. They built cases that seemed airtight. And yet, every time Carl Lee slipped away, to his customers, this failure only increased his value. Here was a man who could outwit the FBI, Mossad, and MI6. A man whose shipments still arrived despite embargoes and sanctions. A man who could get them the tools to wage war and never face consequences. But Lee's success also painted a larger, darker picture. His operations revealed just how fragile the system of global arms control really was. No matter how many sanctions were passed, no matter how many international treaties were signed, all it took was one determined dealer with the right contacts to undermine everything. By the early 2010s, U.S. officials had seen enough. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Justice formally unsealed an indictment against Lee Fengwei. Carl Lee, he was charged with multiple counts of violating sanctions, money laundering, and weapons trafficking. The FBI even placed him on their top 10 most wanted fugitives list and offered a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. But even then, he was never caught, because while the world was hunting him, Carl Lee was quietly evolving his empire once again. When an indictment against Carl Lee became public in 2014, many in the intelligence community believed this was the beginning of his downfall. After all, his face was on FBI posters. His companies were blacklisted. His name was splashed across Western headlines as the man accused of arming America's enemies. But in reality, the opposite happened. Carl Lee was not a man to panic. He had built his empire precisely for moments like this. Almost overnight, the companies named in the indictment vanished. Bank accounts were emptied, shipping records erased, and websites taken offline. But within weeks, new companies emerged with different names, different directors, and new bank account in places as far away as the Seychelles, Belize, and the British Virgin Islands. This was the brilliance of Carl Lee's system. It was designed to be fluid, constantly regenerating, like a hydra that grows 2 heads for every one that is cut off. The FBI knew where he was. Carl Lee had not disappeared into the jungles of Africa or the deserts of the Middle East. He was living comfortably in Dalian, China, running his businesses as if nothing had changed. But that was the problem. Operating from within China gave him an impenetrable shield. U.S. officials could pressure, they could sanction, they could even indict. But without Beijing's cooperation, there was little they could do to physically arrest him. And Beijing had no intention of handing him over. Carl Lee, for all his notoriety, was still a Chinese citizen. And many suspected that his businesses had ties, direct or indirect, to state-owned factories that Beijing considered valuable. Whether the Chinese government actively protected him or simply turned a blind eye, one thing was clear. Carl Lee would not be extradited. So, instead of vanishing, he adapted. He turned more cautious, yes, but also more sophisticated. Money laundering became one of his greatest tools. Using layers of offshore accounts, fake invoices, and trade-based transactions, he could move millions of dollars across borders without ever being detected. A shipment of construction steel might hide specialty alloys for missiles. A payment for farming equipment might really be money wired for gyroscopes. Investigators trying to trace the flow of money often found themselves staring at a maze of shell companies, each one leading to another, until the trail disappeared into secrecy jurisdictions where banking records were impossible to obtain. Even more dangerous was the fact that Carl Lee's network outlived individuals. When one middleman was caught, another stepped in. When one company was sanctioned, a replacement appeared. His empire was no longer just about him. It had become a self-sustaining system of smuggling and shadow finance. For the West, this was maddening. How do you bring down a man who never leaves his home country, who never shows his face, and whose empire cannot be dismantled because it regenerates faster than it can be destroyed? By the late 2010s, some in Washington began to call Carl Lee the Merchant of Death 2.0, comparing him to infamous arms traffickers like Victor Bout. But unlike Bout, who was eventually trapped in a sting operation and arrested in Thailand, Lee seemed untouchable. Every missile test in Iran, every rocket fired by proxies in the Middle East, every whispered rumor of new weapons in North Korea seemed to lead back to him. And yet, he remained free, living a quiet life in Dalian, a ghost in plain sight. But Carl Lee's story was not just about one man. It was about the failure of the international system to stop him. The more governments tried to control weapons, the more valuable men like Carl Lee became. Sanctions created demand. Isolation created opportunity. And into that void stepped a man who saw war not as a tragedy, but as a business. When Western intelligence analysts compared Carl Lee to the infamous Victor Bout, they weren't exaggerating. Bout, the so-called Merchant of Death, had built his empire in the 1990s by supplying warlords and militias across Africa and the Middle East with Soviet-era weapons. He operated fleets of cargo planes, flying weapons into conflict zones under the cover of humanitarian aid. But Bout's empire, though vast, was still rooted in the physical world. Crates of rifles, pallets of ammunition, and Antonov aircraft touching down on dusty runways. It was an empire of movement, visible to satellites, vulnerable to surveillance. Carl Lee's empire, however, was something different. He belonged to a new age. He didn't need fleets of planes or endless convoys. Instead, his weapons often moved invisibly, piece by piece, disguised as industrial goods. A shipment of machine parts might hold missile casings. A box labeled navigation instruments could hide gyroscopes for a nuclear program. By fragmenting the supply chain, Lee turned arms trafficking into a global puzzle that no one agency could fully piece together. Unlike Victor Bout, who thrived in war zones, Carl Lee thrived in boardrooms and trade offices. His battlefields were bank ledgers, customs documents, and freight invoices. He understood that in the 21st century, power didn't just lie in moving weapons. It lay in controlling the financial and logistical networks that made those movements possible, that made him harder to catch. Because while a cargo plane full of rifles is obvious, a mislabeled container in a port of millions is nearly invisible. To his customers, this made him indispensable. Iran, North Korea, Syria, all these regimes depended on the illusion of progress, the ability to show their enemies that they could strike back. Carl Lee provided the hidden scaffolding behind those illusions. He wasn't delivering finished weapons. He was delivering the tools to build them. And that difference meant his reach was far more enduring than Victor Bout's ever was. By the late 2010s, this distinction was clear even to law enforcement. Bout had been caught because he moved through neutral countries, exposed himself to sting operations, and relied on visible infrastructure like aircraft. Lee never made those mistakes. He rarely traveled, never placed himself in vulnerable positions, and operated under the shield of China's sovereignty. In fact, some investigators began to call him the ghost dealer. He existed, and his fingerprints were everywhere, but no one could ever touch him. This new model of arms trafficking also exposed a harsh reality about globalization. The same financial systems, shipping networks, and free trade zones that connected the world also gave men like Lee perfect cover. A company in Hong Kong could wire money to a bank in Belize. A shell firm in the Seychelles could ship goods through Dubai. Every transaction looked ordinary until someone realized that ordinary metals had become the skeleton of a missile. Carl Lee had weaponized globalization itself. And the scariest part? He was not alone. Intelligence reports suggested that his methods had inspired copycats. Smaller traffickers, learning from his model, began to build their own shell company networks. Some even studied his blacklisted firms to see how he had disguised them. In a way, Carl Lee had become not just an arms dealer, but a teacher of the underworld, setting a blueprint for the future of illicit trade. By the end of the decade, the question facing the world was chilling. If one man could outsmart the combined efforts of the FBI, Mossad, and MI6, what would happen when dozens or hundreds followed his footsteps? By the late 2010s, the frustration inside Western intelligence circles was palpable. Carl Lee had been indicted, sanctioned, blacklisted, and plastered across wanted lists, and yet he was still doing business. The FBI tried new approaches. They shifted from targeting Lee directly to dismantling the infrastructure around him. Teams began tracing financial flows across offshore havens, hoping to freeze accounts before the money disappeared into another shell. The U.S. Treasury Department launched aggressive campaigns against the banks suspected of handling his transactions, warning them of billion-dollar fines if they failed to act. Some progress was made. A few shipments were intercepted. A handful of middlemen were arrested in Europe and the Middle East. But the core problem remained. Carl Lee himself never surfaced. He remained in Dalian, conducting business through layers of intermediaries, never exposing himself to direct risk. Even cyber tracking, which many hoped would finally pierce the veil, proved challenging. Lee's network relied on secure communications, disposable email accounts, and constantly shifting domains. By the time investigators cracked into one system, Lee had already moved to another. The U.S. even tried pressuring shipping companies. Large freight carriers were warned that if they were caught moving Carl Lee's goods, they would face massive penalties. In some cases, this worked. Suspicious containers were stopped at ports. But Lee adapted again. He began routing cargo through smaller, less scrutinized operators, often in countries with weaker enforcement systems. The result was a deadly game of cat and mouse. Each move by Western governments only seemed to make Lee smarter, more elusive, more refined in his tactics. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the consequences were being felt. Iran tested new missiles. Proxies like Hezbollah boasted of upgraded weaponry. North Korea, too, made surprising advances in its missile technology. And in the background of each of these developments, intelligence reports kept circling back to the same name, Carl Lee. For the men and women tracking him, the irony was infuriating. Here was a man who was not hiding in caves or on the run across borders. He was living openly, sometimes even giving business lectures in China under his legal name, Li Fengwei. Yet, because of geopolitical realities, he was untouchable. The United States had caught Victor Bout by luring him into a sting operation in Thailand. But how do you set a trap for someone who refuses to leave home soil, whose home soil is protected by one of the most powerful governments in the world? That question haunted investigators. It also raised uncomfortable truths. Was Carl Lee a rogue criminal operating for profit alone, or was he quietly tolerated, perhaps even used, by his own government? After all, his deals didn't just enrich him. They also advanced the strategic interests of countries aligned, however loosely, with Beijing's global goals. To this day, no one has a clear answer. But one fact became undeniable. Carl Lee had redefined what it meant to be an arms dealer in the modern era. He was not a gun runner in the traditional sense. He was a broker of technologies, a master of logistics, and architect of invisible pipelines. And as the world struggled to keep up, one thing became clear. The story of Carl Lee was not just about one man. It was about the future of warfare itself, where shadow networks and hidden transactions could shape battles before a single shot was fired. By the early 2020s, the pursuit of Carl Lee had become less about law enforcement and more about grand strategy. Inside Washington, London, and Brussels, analysts began to admit something uncomfortable. Catching Carl Lee was no longer just about stopping a criminal. It was about confronting the shadow war between the United States and China. Every report that crossed the desks of policymakers seemed to underline the same point. Iran's missile program, fueled by materials traced back to Lee's network. North Korea's ability to skirt sanctions and test new weapons. Again, components linked to Dalian suppliers. Armed groups in the Middle East upgrading their arsenals. Once more, Lee's fingerprints were all over the supply chain. But here was a dilemma. If Western governments pushed too hard, accusing China of shielding him, the fragile web of diplomatic and economic ties could unravel. China was, after all, the world's second-largest economy and a critical trade partner. So Lee thrived in a gray zone, too big for local law enforcement to touch, too politically sensitive for global powers to risk direct confrontation. He existed at the intersection of profit, power, and politics. Meanwhile, in the shadows, intelligence agencies were still trying. Cyber operations were launched against his network. Secret financial task forces traced his money across shell accounts in the Caribbean and Eastern Europe. At one point, Western operatives even considered recruiting insiders within his company, Chinese nationals who might be willing to betray him. But the attempts fell short. Either the targets were too loyal, too afraid, or perhaps too closely monitored. And then came a chilling realization. Maybe Carl Lee didn't need protection from his government. Maybe he was, in fact, a tool of it. Think about it. By allowing a figure like Lee to operate, Beijing could plausibly deny direct involvement in controversial arms deals while still benefiting strategically. It was a perfect arrangement. Lee got rich, his clients got weapons, and China avoided fingerprints on the crime scene. This theory circulated heavily among Western intelligence communities. And whether true or not, it added to the aura around Lee. He wasn't just a fugitive arms dealer anymore. He was, in the minds of many, a living symbol of how the world order was changing. The era of Victor Bout had been defined by backroom deals, gun drops in jungles, and shadow flights into war zones. Carl Lee's era was different. His was about technology, networks, and states turning a blind eye, and perhaps most unsettling of all, for every Carl Lee that the world could name, how many others remain invisible? How many arms brokers were out there, hidden in plain sight, facilitating the next great conflict while the rest of the world remained distracted? That's the frightening legacy of Carl Lee. He isn't just a man the FBI can't catch. He's a signpost pointing to a new reality, where the lines between criminality, business, and geopolitics blur until they're almost indistinguishable. Carl Lee's name may never be as famous as Victor Bout's. He doesn't appear in Hollywood movies, and there are no dramatic mugshots of him in handcuffs. Instead, his legend lives in silence, in the shadows of financial systems, in the supply chains of weapons programs, and in the whispers of intelligence reports that most of us will never see. And perhaps that is what makes him far more dangerous. Victor Bout's downfall came when he overstepped, when he left the safety of his networks and walked into a sting operation. Carl Lee has not made that mistake. He stays at home, behind borders that are not just lines on a map, but shields made of global politics, economics, and fear of escalation. Every attempt to catch him only highlights how the world has changed. In the old days, arms dealers moved crates of AK-47s in the belly of cargo planes. Today, they move alloys, precision tools, and circuit boards, the unseen parts that make modern warfare possible. And that is the truth. Carl Lee is not just an arms dealer. He is a merchant of the future of conflict. His story is a mirror showing us how war has evolved. From guns in the jungle to drones, cyber weapons, and missiles built from stolen blueprints and smuggled components. The most unsettling question remains: what comes next? If Carl Lee could build a global empire from inside a single Chinese city, protected by shadows, what about the next generation dealers? What about the networks that haven't been uncovered yet? Because make no mistake, there will always be another. As long as there is demand, there will be supply. As long as nations seek power, there will be someone willing to sell them the tools to grab it. And as long as the world hesitates to confront the root of these networks, men like Carl Lee will remain untouchable. So maybe the Real story is not about him at all. Maybe it's about us, about the world we have built, where criminals can hide behind the shield of geopolitics, where technology advances faster than the laws men control it, and where the future of war is traded like a commodity. Carl Lee is still out there. He's still doing business, still moving in the shadows of the global system, still shaping the world in ways most of us will never see until it's too late. And that, perhaps, is his greatest victory. Fire if you made it this far. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Carl Lee is just a clever criminal or a tool being used by powerful states? Drop your answers in the comment below. Let's start a conversation. And if you want more deep stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Zimo Voice. It helps us keep uncovering the untold stories that shape our world. Until next time, stay curious and stay aware.